August 13th, 1942. Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. The airstrip was barely finished. Coral dust hung in the air like smoke. 19 Marine pilots stood beside their aircraft. Grumman F-4F Wildcats, stubby, ungainly fighters that looked like they'd been designed by someone who'd never seen a bird. The planes were already showing wear. Oil streaks ran down their cowlings. Fabric control surfaces were patched with whatever the mechanics could find. One aircraft had a replacement panel painted a different shade of blue. They called themselves the Cactus Air Force, after the island's code name. It was not an official designation. It was a joke, really. A bit of dark humor for men who knew they were surrounded, outnumbered, and flying obsolete machines against the finest fighter pilots in the world. 300 miles to the north, at Rabaul, Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa read the intelligence report with something close to amusement. The Americans had landed on Guadalcanal. They had seized the airfield Japan had spent months building, and now they were trying to defend it with what? He read the aircraft inventory again. 19 fighters, 12 dive bombers, Wildcats and Dauntlesses. The report listed their specifications. Maximum speed of the F-4F Wildcat, 278 miles per hour. The Mitsubishi, a 6M0, 331 miles per hour. Rate of climb, Wildcat, 2,000 feet per minute. 0, 3,000 feet per minute. Turn radius. The Zero could complete a full turn in under 10 seconds. The Wildcat needed 15. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Mikawa set the report down. He lit a cigarette. Around him, his staff officers waited. "The Americans," he said quietly, "have given us their weakest aircraft, their newest pilots, and an airfield we can bomb whenever we choose. They are trapped on an island they cannot supply, flying machines they cannot replace, fighting a battle they cannot win." One of his officers, Commander Takoshi Haido, nodded. "Our intelligence confirms most of their pilots arrived just days ago. Green, untested. They've never faced a Zero in combat." "And our pilots?" Mikawa asked, though he already knew. "Veterans, sir. Men from the China campaign, from Pearl Harbor, from the East Indies. Average flight time, 800 hours. Some over 1,000. They've been flying Zeros for years." Mikawa exhaled smoke slowly. "Then this will not be a battle. It will be a demonstration. How long until we retake the island?" Haido consulted his notes. "The army is preparing a counter-offensive. General Hyakutake believes he can retake Henderson Field in 6 weeks, perhaps less. The Marines are isolated. No significant reinforcements. Limited supplies. Once we destroy their aircraft, the island is ours." Mikawa stood, walked to the map on the wall. Guadalcanal was a green smudge in a blue ocean. Henderson Field, a tiny mark on its northern coast. He traced the distance from Rabaul to Guadalcanal with his finger. "We can reach them in 90 minutes. Bomb them, strafe them, return for lunch." He turned back to his staff. "Initiate Operation Car. 27 bombers, 18 Zeros. Daily raids until their air force ceases to exist." He paused, "And send a message to Admiral Yamamoto. Inform him that the Americans' Cactus Air Force will be eradicated within the week." The room was confident. The math was simple, the conclusion inevitable. But what neither Mikawa nor any officer in that room understood was that they were not looking at an air battle. They were looking at a system. And that system, crude and improvised as it was about to reveal something the Japanese High Command had failed to grasp since Pearl Harbor. That in modern war, the side that adapts fastest wins. Not the side with the best planes or the most skilled pilots. The side that learns. The Guadalcanal campaign did not begin with airplanes. It began with intelligence. In May 1942, American codebreakers intercepted Japanese communications, revealing construction of an airfield on a remote island in the Solomon Chain. Guadalcanal. Most Americans had never heard of it. But the strategists in Washington understood immediately. An airfield there would threaten the supply line between the United States and Australia. It would extend Japan's bomber range deep into the South Pacific. It would turn a defensive perimeter into an offensive platform. The decision was made quickly. Seize the island, deny Japan the airfield, turn it against them. On August 7, 1942, the 1st Marine Division landed on Guadalcanal's beaches. They expected heavy resistance. They found none. The Japanese construction workers fled into the jungle. The Marines walked onto the airfield, surprised to find it nearly complete. Bulldozers still warm, tools abandoned. The Japanese had been so confident in their security that they hadn't even fortified the position. The Marines renamed it Henderson Field after a pilot killed at Midway. Within a week, they had it operational. But operational is a relative term. Henderson Field in August 1942 was barely an airstrip. It was a clearing carved from jungle, coral gravel, not concrete. No revetments, no fuel storage, no proper maintenance facilities. When it rained, the field became mud. When it dried, the coral dust choked engines and blinded pilots on landing. The aircraft that arrived were not fresh from factories. They were whatever could be spared. The F-4F Wildcat was, by 1942 standards, already obsolescent. It had been designed in 1937, when biplanes still filled carrier decks. It was slower than the Zero, less maneuverable. Its controls were heavier. It couldn't climb as fast or turn as tight. On paper, it was outmatched in every category that mattered in a dogfight. But the Wildcat had one quality that didn't appear in specification sheets. It was durable. Its airframe could absorb damage that would tear a Zero apart. It had armor plating behind the pilot's seat, self-sealing fuel tanks that wouldn't explode when punctured, a radial engine that could run with cylinders shot out. The Wildcat was built to survive. The Zero was built to dominate. This difference, structural, philosophical, would define everything that followed. The Japanese Zero was a masterpiece of engineering in the purest sense. It achieved performance by eliminating weight, no armor, no self-sealing tanks, lightweight construction throughout. In the hands of an expert pilot, it was unbeatable in a turning fight. But it was fragile. A single burst of .50 caliber fire could set it aflame. Its fuel tanks were vulnerable. Its airframe, magnesium and aluminum, burned white hot when hit. The design philosophy was clear. The best defense is not being hit. Japanese doctrine trained pilots to avoid damage through superior maneuverability. It worked brilliantly, until it didn't. The Americans who arrived at Henderson Field in mid-August 1942 did not know they were walking into history. They were exhausted. Most had never seen combat. They'd been rushed through training, shipped across the Pacific, and deposited on an island that looked like the end of the world. Major John L. Smith commanded the 1st Squadron, VMF 223. He had 20 pilots, 19 Wildcats, no spare parts, no backup aircraft. If a plane was lost, it was gone. The mechanics worked miracles. They cannibalized wrecked aircraft for parts, fabricated replacements from scrap metal, patched bullet holes with aluminum from downed Japanese planes. One mechanic later recalled, "We didn't fix airplanes. We assembled flying parts and prayed they'd hold together long enough to matter." Fuel was rationed. Every gallon had to be shipped from Australia or New Caledonia, transported by slow cargo ships vulnerable to submarine attack. When fuel ran low, pilots were told to conserve, fly slower, climb gradually, don't waste a drop. Ammunition was counted. Each Wildcat carried 1,800 rounds across 6 wing-mounted .50 caliber Browning machine guns, 300 rounds per gun. In combat, that was 15 seconds of fire. Pilots learned to shoot in short bursts. 1 second, 2 seconds, no more. Miss, and you might not get another chance. The Japanese, flying from Rabaul, had no such constraints. Their logistics were strained, yes, but they had fuel, they had ammunition, they had mechanics and spare parts. What they had, most importantly, was confidence. The air war over Guadalcanal began on August 20th. 1942, 27. Betty bombers, escorted by 18 Zeros, appeared over Henderson Field at noon. The Marines had 15 minutes warning, courtesy of a Coast Watcher network, Australian scouts hidden in the islands who radioed Japanese movements. 15 minutes to scramble, to start engines, to take off into a maelstrom. Captain Marion Carl was among the first airborne. He climbed to intercept, Wildcats straining, engine roaring. At 8,000 feet, he saw them. The bomber formation, tight and disciplined. And above, the Zeros, gleaming in the sun. He radioed his wingman. "Stay with me. Don't try to turn with them." It was the first rule they'd been taught. Never turn with a Zero. You'll lose. The engagement lasted 12 minutes. The Wildcats attacked from above, diving through the formation. Carl fired a burst into a Betty. Saw smoke, pulled up hard. A Zero was on him instantly. He didn't try to turn. He dove. The Zero followed. Carl pushed the Wildcat into a steep dive, pulling 5 Gs, 6. The Zero stayed with him, but at 400 miles per hour, Carl pulled back on the stick. The Wildcat, heavier, more robust, could handle it. The Zero couldn't. Its lighter airframe couldn't sustain the G-forces at that speed. The pilot had to ease off or risk structural failure. Carl climbed, repositioned, dived again. This time he got a shot, a 2-second burst. 50 caliber rounds tore into the Zero's wing. It rolled, smoking, fell away. Carl didn't watch it crash. He was already looking for the next target. When the engagement ended, the Marines had shot down 3 bombers and 2 Zeros. They lost 1 Wildcat. The pilot bailed out, was recovered. That night, the Japanese staff at Rabaul reviewed the reports. The losses were acceptable. The Americans had fought, yes, but they hadn't stopped the raid. Bombs had hit Henderson Field. Damage was inflicted. Commander Haido compiled the analysis. The enemy fighters are aggressive but predictable. Their pilots avoid turning engagements. They rely on diving attacks. Our Zeros maintain superiority in maneuverability. Recommendation: continue daily raids. Attrition will favor us. The report was confident, the logic sound, but it missed something crucial. The Americans weren't trying to win dogfights. They were trying to survive them. And survival, in war, is the first step to learning. Over the next 2 weeks, the pattern repeated. Japanese bombers from Rabaul, Zero escorts, Marine Wildcats scrambling to intercept. Every engagement taught the Americans something new. They learned that the Zero could outturn them, but couldn't outdive them. That at high speed, the Wildcat's heavier construction became an advantage. That the Zero's lightweight ailerons locked up above 300 miles per hour, making it unable to roll quickly in a dive. They learned to fight in pairs, one Wildcat as bait, drawing the Zero into a turn, the other diving from above, taking the shot while the Zero was committed. They called it the Thach Weave, named after Lieutenant Commander John Thach, who'd developed it before the war. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't about skill. It was about geometry. 2 Wildcats working together could defeat a Zero that could destroy either one alone. The Japanese pilots noticed the change. Their reports began to mention coordinated attacks, disciplined tactics, Americans who no longer tried to turn fight but who used altitude and speed like weapons. But the reports also emphasized victories. Zeros still dominated the skies. American losses continued. On paper, Japan was winning, and that was the problem. They were measuring success by the wrong metric. At Henderson Field, the situation was deteriorating. The nightly bombardments from Japanese warships, the Tokyo Express, destroyed aircraft on the ground. Fuel supplies dwindled. Food rations were cut. Malaria spread through the Marines. Pilots flew missions while sick, feverish, barely able to focus. By early September, the Cactus Air Force was down to 11 operational fighters, but they were still flying, and they were learning faster than the Japanese realized. Major John Smith kept a log. After every mission, he debriefed his pilots. What worked, what didn't. He compiled lessons, shared them, refined tactics. The Americans were treating combat like an experiment. Hypothesis, test, result, iterate. The Japanese, meanwhile, were flying the same way they always had. Why change? They were winning, weren't they? On September 12, 1942, a Japanese convoy attempted to land reinforcements on Guadalcanal, 6 transports escorted by destroyers. The plan was to reach the island under cover of darkness, unload, and withdraw before dawn. But coast watchers spotted them. Henderson Field scrambled everything that could fly. 5 Wildcats, 4 Dauntless dive bombers, against 6 transports and a destroyer screen. The attack was chaotic. Zeros from Rabaul arrived mid-strike. The sky became a whirlwind of tracers and smoke. But the dive bombers got through. 2 transports hit, 1 sinking. The convoy turned back. That night, Admiral Mikawa reviewed the report with growing frustration. A handful of American aircraft had turned back an entire convoy. How? He demanded. How are they still operational? His staff offered explanations. American supplies must be getting through. Submarines, perhaps. Or nighttime cargo runs. The airfield should have been destroyed weeks ago. Commander Haido was silent. He'd been reviewing pilot reports, reading between the lines. The Americans weren't just surviving. They were adapting. Their tactics had improved. Their coordination was better. They were fighting smarter, not harder. But he said nothing. To suggest the Americans were learning would imply Japanese tactics were flawed, and that was unthinkable. By late September 1942, the Guadalcanal campaign had reached a stalemate. Neither side could dislodge the other. The Japanese controlled the seas at night, bombarding Henderson Field and landing supplies. The Americans controlled the air by day, attacking any Japanese ship caught in daylight. It was a war of attrition. And in wars of attrition, logistics determine outcomes. The Japanese supply line from Rabaul to Guadalcanal was 300 miles. Every gallon of fuel, every bomb, every bullet had to be shipped or flown, and American submarines were hunting those supply lines relentlessly. The American supply line ran from Australia and New Caledonia, over 1,000 miles. But it was a line the Japanese couldn't cut. American cargo ships, escorted by destroyers, made the run regularly, slowly, painfully, but consistently. The difference was systemic. Japan's entire strategy depended on speed, quick victories, rapid conquest, consolidation. They had never planned for a grinding, multi-month campaign where endurance mattered more than brilliance. The United States, conversely, had built its war economy for exactly this. The factories in Detroit, Pittsburgh, Los Angeles were now producing aircraft faster than they could be destroyed. In September 1942 alone, American factories completed over 6,000 military aircraft. Japan produced fewer than 900. Every week, new Wildcats arrived at Henderson Field. Not many, 3, 5, 8. But they came. Slowly, the Cactus Air Force grew. By early October, they had 23 operational fighters, then 29. The Japanese, reading these numbers, were baffled. "We destroy their aircraft daily," one report noted. "Yet their numbers increase. Where are they coming from?" The answer was simple. America's industrial base had fully mobilized. For every Wildcat lost over Guadalcanal, 3 more rolled off production lines in Bethpage, New York. Grumman Aircraft was producing 1 F-4F every 8 hours. The equation was brutal. Japan could win every engagement and still lose the war. October 12, 1942. The Imperial Japanese Army launched its major offensive to retake Henderson Field. 15,000 troops moved through the jungle, converging on the marine perimeter. The plan was coordinated. Ground assault at night, air superiority by day, overwhelming force. General Hyakutake was confident. The Marines numbered barely 6,000. They were outnumbered, outgunned, exhausted. The assault began after midnight. Japanese forces attacked from the south, hoping to break through and overrun the airfield. The fighting was brutal, hand to hand. Marines held ridgelines by feet, not miles. By dawn, the attack had stalled. The Marines held, barely. Henderson Field was intact, and when the sun rose, the Cactus Air Force took off. They bombed Japanese positions throughout the day, strafed supply lines, attacked reinforcement attempts. The Japanese had achieved tactical surprise, but couldn't sustain the offensive. Without control of the air, they couldn't resupply, couldn't maneuver freely. By October 14th, the assault had failed. Hyakutake withdrew his forces into the jungle. Over 3,000 Japanese soldiers were dead or wounded. The failure shocked Tokyo. How had 15,000 men been stopped by 6,000? Admiral Yamamoto, reading the after-action reports, understood. "It's the airfield," he said quietly. "As long as they hold Henderson Field, they control the battle space." He ordered increased naval bombardments, heavier air raids. The island had to be taken, but the window was closing. In Washington, the Joint Chiefs of Staff were watching Guadalcanal with intense focus. It was the first major American offensive of the war. If it failed, the entire Pacific strategy would collapse. Reinforcements were authorized. The 1st Marine Division, decimated by combat and disease, would be reinforced by army units. More aircraft, more supplies, more men. But getting them there required ships, and ships required escorts, and escorts required fuel. The logistics were staggering. Every decision rippled outward, affecting production schedules, convoy routes, submarine deployments. It was a three-dimensional chess game played across an ocean. By late October, the Cactus Air Force had grown to 42 operational fighters, a mix of Wildcats and a few newer F-4U Corsairs. Pilots rotated in and out. Some had been there since August. Others arrived fresh from training. But all of them learned the same lessons. Don't turn fight. Use altitude. Stick with your wingman. Shoot fast. Survive. The Zero was still the better fighter in theory, but theory was colliding with reality. Japanese pilot quality was declining. The veterans from China and Pearl Harbor were being killed, one by one. Irreplaceable. The replacements had less training, fewer hours, less experience. Meanwhile, American pilot training had accelerated. New programs stateside were graduating hundreds of pilots monthly, each one with more flight time than the Japanese replacements, better gunnery training, better instrument flying. The qualitative gap was narrowing. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By early November, the nature of the air war had shifted. The Japanese still launched raids from Rabaul, but now every raid faced stiffer resistance, more interceptors, better coordination. Coast watchers gave advance warning. Radar, primitive but functional, tracked incoming formations. The Marines scrambled earlier, climbed higher, positioned for ideal attack angles. Japanese losses mounted. 3 bombers lost, 5, 7. Zeros shot down, trying to protect them. The ratio was becoming unsustainable. Commander Haido reviewed November's statistics with mounting alarm. In 30 days, Japan had lost 43 aircraft over Guadalcanal, 17 Zeros, 26 bombers. American losses, 19 fighters. He drafted a report for Admiral Mikawa. The air campaign over Guadalcanal is reaching critical sustainability thresholds. Current attrition rates cannot be maintained beyond 60 days without significant reinforcement. The report was factual, clinical. It avoided the word defeat, but the implication was clear. Mikawa read it in silence. Then he summoned his staff. How many operational zeros do we have at Rabaul? Haido consulted his notes. 57, sir. Down from 90 in August. And replacements? 12 arrived last week. 6 more expected by month's end. So we're losing aircraft faster than we can replace them. Yes, sir. Mikawa stood, paced. His confidence from August was gone, replaced by something harder. Resignation. The Americans were supposed to be trapped, isolated, defeated by now. It's been 90 days. 90 days, the time frame they'd promised Tokyo. 6 weeks had become 3 months. The isolated Marines had become a fortified garrison. The obsolete Wildcats had become an effective air force, and the island they'd dismissed as a minor diversion had become a grinding, bloody stalemate that was consuming resources Japan couldn't afford to lose. What changed? Mikawa asked. Not to Haido, to the room, to himself. What did we miss? No one answered, because the answer was too uncomfortable. They had missed that war wasn't about equipment, it was about systems. The Americans had built a system, crude, improvised, held together with desperation and ingenuity. But it worked, it learned, it adapted, and it endured. November 13th, 1942, the waters off Guadalcanal turned into a killing ground. For 3 nights, American and Japanese warships clashed in close-range battles that would be remembered as some of the most savage naval engagements in history. The Japanese called it the Third Battle of the Solomon Sea. The Americans called it the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal. Both sides called it chaos. The Japanese plan was ambitious. Admiral Hiroaki Abe would bombard Henderson Field with battleships, destroying the airfield once and for all. Then, transports would land 11,000 troops and heavy equipment. The American garrison would be overwhelmed. The island retaken. The plan required surprise, speed, and naval supremacy. They achieved none of these. On the night of November 12th, American radar detected the Japanese task force approaching. 2 battleships, Hiei and Kirishima, accompanied by cruisers and destroyers. Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan, outnumbered and outgunned, made a decision that defied doctrine. He would attack, at point-blank range, in darkness. The engagement began at 1:48 a.m. Ships passed within 1,000 yards of each other. Searchlights swept the water, torpedoes crossed wakes, shells fired at such close range they barely had time to arm before impact. The cruiser USS Atlanta was caught in a crossfire, torpedoed. Admiral Norman Scott killed on the bridge. The destroyer USS Cushing rammed by friendly fire. The USS Laffey, close to within 20 yards of a Japanese battleship, fired every gun, was obliterated by return fire. But the Japanese didn't escape unscathed. The battleship Hiei, hit by over 50 shells, was crippled, dead in the water. When dawn broke, she was still there, helpless, visible. At Henderson Field, every aircraft that could fly took off. Wildcats, Dauntlesses, even a few Army Air Force B-17 seconds that had landed the day before. They found Hiei limping north at 5 knots, trailing smoke. The attacks continued all morning. Dive bombers, torpedo planes, strafing runs. By afternoon, Hiei was listing, burning, taking water. Her crew abandoned ship. She sank that evening, the first Japanese battleship lost in World War II. At Rabaul, Admiral Mikawa received the news in stunned silence. A battleship, gone. Destroyed by land-based aircraft they were supposed to have eliminated 3 months ago. Commander Haido spoke carefully. Sir, the transport convoy is approaching Guadalcanal. Should we recall them? Mikawa stared at the map. 11 ships, 11,000 men, equipment, supplies, everything needed to retake the island. But now, Without naval bombardment to suppress Henderson Field, those transports would be sailing into daylight, into range of American aircraft. "Continue," Mikawa ordered. "The troops must land." Hido hesitated. "Sir, in daylight, without air cover." "I know the risks, Commander, but if we turn back now, the offensive fails. The island is lost." "Continue." The convoy continued. And on November 14th, the Cactus Air Force tore it apart. Wave after wave of Marine and Navy aircraft attacked throughout the day, dive bombers screaming down from 8,000 feet, torpedo planes skimming wave tops, Wildcats strafing decks. By sunset, 7 of the 11 transports were sunk or burning, 4,000 Japanese soldiers drowned, equipment lost, supplies destroyed. The survivors who reached shore did so without heavy weapons, without adequate ammunition, without the means to sustain an offensive. That night, Admiral Mikawa sent a coded message to Tokyo. Guadalcanal operation suspended. Naval and air losses unsustainable. Recommend strategic reassessment. He did not use the word retreat. He did not need to. Everyone who read the message understood. Japan had lost Guadalcanal, not because they were outfought, because they were outlasted. The realization spread through the Japanese command structure like a slow poison. At Rabaul, pilots who had flown since August were exhausted. Missions that had once been routine were now survival tests. The Americans, they reported, were everywhere. More aircraft, better tactics, coordinated attacks. 1-0 pilot, Saburo Sakai, a veteran ace with 64 kills, wrote in his diary after a mission over Guadalcanal, "We are fighting ghosts. We shoot them down, and they return. We bomb their airfield, and they repair it overnight. We sink their ships, and more arrive. This is not war, this is arithmetic, and we are losing." The numbers confirmed what the pilots felt. In November 1942, Japan lost 81 aircraft over Guadalcanal. The Americans lost 43. But the Americans replaced all 43 within 2 weeks. Japan replaced 17. The deficit grew daily. By December, Japanese air operations over Guadalcanal had effectively ceased, not because they surrendered the sky, because they had nothing left to send. The Zeros that remained at Rabaul were held in reserve, too valuable to risk, too few to matter. Meanwhile, the Cactus Air Force, once 19 obsolete Wildcats, now numbered over 70 fighters. F-4F Wildcats, F-4U Corsairs, P-38 Lightnings. The Marines were reinforced by Navy and Army Air Force squadrons. The improvised Air Force had become an air armada. At Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo, the debate was bitter. The Army wanted to continue, send more troops, more supplies, hold Guadalcanal at any cost. The Navy calculated the cost: 50 warships sunk or damaged, over 600 aircraft lost, nearly 30,000 men dead, wounded, or starving in the jungle. Admiral Yamamoto, silent through much of the debate, finally spoke. "Gentlemen, we are feeding men into a furnace. Guadalcanal cannot be held. The question is not whether we withdraw. The question is how many more lives we sacrifice before we admit defeat." The room went silent. No one had spoken the word defeat aloud. It hung there, terrible and true. A staff officer, younger, angrier, stood. "Admiral, we cannot abandon Japanese soldiers. The Emperor has declared—" "The Emperor," Yamamoto interrupted, his voice cold, "has declared nothing about this specific island. We have declared it vital. We have made it a symbol. And now we are dying for a symbol." He turned to the map on the wall. Guadalcanal. A tiny speck. "This island has cost us more than any victory we achieved in 6 months of conquest. And for what? An airfield we cannot supply, a garrison we cannot reinforce, a position we cannot defend." He paused. "The Americans understand something we have forgotten. They fight wars of production. Every ship we sink, they build 2 more. Every plane we destroy, they build 5. Every pilot we kill, they train 10. He faced the room. We are not losing battles on Guadalcanal. We are losing a war of endurance. And if we do not withdraw now, in an organized manner, we will lose the entire garrison. 20,000 men, for nothing. The silence stretched, then, slowly, heads nodded. The decision was made. Operation K, the evacuation of Guadalcanal. It would take weeks to plan, longer to execute, and it would be called a strategic withdrawal, not a defeat. But everyone in that room knew the truth. The evacuation began in late January 1943. Under cover of darkness, Japanese destroyers made high-speed runs to Guadalcanal, evacuating troops in small groups. They called these runs the Rat Express, the Tokyo Express in reverse. Over 3 nights, they evacuated 10,000 men. Sick, starving, many barely able to walk. On February 9, 1943, the last Japanese soldier left Guadalcanal. The island was American. The campaign had lasted exactly 6 months, from August 7, 1942 to February 9, 1943. In that time, Japan had lost over 25,000 men, over 800 aircraft, 24 warships. The United States had lost 7,000 men, over 600 aircraft, 29 warships. Both sides had bled, but only one side could afford it. At Henderson Field, now a major American airbase with paved runways, fuel depots, and maintenance facilities, Major John Smith stood watching aircraft land, F-4U Corsairs, brand new, factory fresh. He thought about August, 19 Wildcats, coral dust, patched bullet holes. They'd been given 6 weeks to live, they'd lasted 6 months, and now the island was secure, the supply line to Australia protected, the first major American offensive victory of the war. But Smith didn't celebrate. He'd lost too many pilots, seen too many friends die. He understood what the victory meant strategically, but personally it felt hollow. That evening, he wrote in his journal, "We won not because we were better, we won because we lasted longer. The Japanese flew better planes, had better pilots, fought with more skill, but they couldn't replace what they lost. We could. That's the only difference. That's the whole war." Commander Haido, evacuated from Rabaul to Truk, wrote his final report on the Guadalcanal campaign. It was 23 pages, detailed, clinical, unsparing. The conclusion read, "The fundamental error was strategic, not tactical. We assumed American industrial capacity was limited. We assumed their will to fight was fragile. We assumed they could not sustain operations far from their home bases. All 3 assumptions were false. The Americans demonstrated an ability to learn, adapt, and outproduce us at every level. Their victory at Guadalcanal was not achieved through superior tactics or technology. It was achieved through superior logistics and systemic resilience." He paused, then added a final paragraph. "The Cactus Air Force began with 19 obsolete fighters. We laughed. We thought them finished. But they were not fighting to win dogfights. They were fighting to survive. And survival, sustained long enough, becomes victory. This is the lesson of Guadalcanal. This is the lesson we learned too late." The report was filed, read by senior officers, quietly buried, because its implications were too painful. It meant that Japan's entire strategy, the lightning war, the decisive battle, the warrior ethos, was obsolete. That modern war was won not by brilliance but by endurance, not by perfection but by mass production, not by the best fighters but by enough fighters. In the years that followed, Guadalcanal became a symbol. For Americans, it was the proof that Japan could be defeated, that island hopping could work, that the long road to Tokyo was possible. For Japan, it was the beginning of the end, the first major defeat, the first retreat, the first crack in the myth of invincibility. Every loss afterward was measured against Guadalcanal, and every one was worse. The F-4F Wildcat, the ugly duckling fighter that was supposed to be obsolete, went on to serve throughout the war. It fought in North Africa, in Europe, in every theatre. By war's end, Wildcats had shot down over 1,000 enemy aircraft. Not because they were the best, because they were durable, reliable, and abundant. The perfect weapon for a war of attrition. The Zero, meanwhile, remained unchanged. Japan couldn't afford to redesign it, couldn't retool factories, couldn't stop production long enough to improve. So the same aircraft that had dominated in 1941 was still flying in 1945, outclassed, outgunned, outnumbered. By 1945, the industrial gap had become an abyss. The United States was producing 15,000 aircraft per month. Japan, fewer than 1,500. The ratio was 10 to 1. And that ratio defined every battle, every campaign, every outcome. The warriors who had laughed at the Cactus Air Force in August 1942 were dead, or prisoners, or watching from the home islands as American B-29 seconds turned their cities to ash. And they understood, finally, that they had been fighting the wrong war. They had prepared for a war of skill and spirit. America had fought a war of systems and steel. The final lesson of Guadalcanal was not written in tactics manuals. It was written in production reports, in casualty statistics, in the slow, grinding mathematics of attrition. Victory goes not to the side that fights best, but to the side that fights longest, to the side that can absorb losses and continue, to the side that builds faster than the enemy can destroy. Japan had designed a military for perfection. America had designed one for durability, and when perfection met durability over months of grinding combat, durability won, every single time. The admirals who had laughed at the Wildcats in August had stopped laughing by November. By February, they were evacuating, and by war's end, they were surrendering. Not because they lacked courage, not because they lacked skill, because they lacked factories. In the end, Guadalcanal was decided not in the skies over Henderson Field, but in the shipyards of Newport News, the aircraft plants of Bethpage, the steel mills of Pittsburgh. The Cactus Air Force was just the visible edge of an invisible machine, a machine that turned ore into aircraft, recruits into pilots, defeat into endurance, and endurance into victory. The Japanese commanders had calculated everything: the range of their aircraft, the skill of their pilots, the vulnerability of American positions. But they had not calculated the one variable that mattered most: America's capacity to build, adapt, and outlast. And so, the war that Japan thought would be won in 6 months was lost in 90 days on a single jungle island. Because they fought with what they had, and America fought with what it could make. The sleeping giant had awakened, and it brought its factories with it. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. The morning of May 5th, 1943, 600 miles west of Ireland, Kapitän Lieutenant Klaus Hartmann stood in the conning tower of U-192, scanning the grey Atlantic horizon through his Zeiss binoculars. His boat had been at sea for 37 days. His crew was exhausted, but their spirits remained high. They were part of Gruppe Star, a wolf pack of 19 submarines stretched across the convoy routes. And just yesterday, they had received the signal they'd been waiting for. Convoy ONS-5 spotted. All boats converge. This was the moment Hartmann had trained for his entire career. The Wolfpack tactic had made the Kriegsmarine's U-boat arm the most feared force in the Atlantic. In the past 3 months alone, they had sent over 200 Allied ships to the bottom. The mathematics of the war favoured Germany. Britain was losing the Battle of the Atlantic, and everyone knew it. But as Hartmann lowered his binoculars and prepared to give the order to dive and attack, something appeared on the horizon that would shatter everything he believed about submarine warfare. Something that shouldn't have been there. Something impossible. An aircraft carrier. In the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, 1,000 miles from the nearest Allied airfield. Within 72 hours, Hartmann would be dead. His boat would be one of 5 U-boats sunk by this single carrier group in just 4 days, and by the end of the month, 41 German submarines would be destroyed, the highest monthly loss rate in the entire war. The Wolfpack, that brilliant tactical innovation that had brought Britain to the edge of starvation, had encountered its executioner. This is the story of how Germany's supreme naval weapon was systematically dismantled in 31 days of catastrophic violence, and how the U-boat commanders, the aces who had ruled the Atlantic for 3 years, came to understand with dawning horror that they were no longer the hunters, they were the prey. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. To understand the shock of Black May, you must first understand what came before it. The Wolfpack wasn't just a tactic, it was a revolution in naval warfare, and the man who perfected it was one of the most brilliant and ruthless strategists Germany produced in the entire war, Admiral Karl Dönitz. Dönitz had served aboard U-boats in the First World War. He had experienced firsthand the terror of being depth-charged, the claustrophobia of a damaged submarine limping home, and, most importantly, the fundamental limitation of submarine warfare as it was then practiced. Individual boats, hunting alone, simply couldn't sink enough ships to matter. But Dönitz had a vision. What if submarines didn't hunt alone? What if they operated as a pack, coordinated by radio, converging on a single convoy from multiple directions at once? The concept was elegant and devastating. U-boats would form a patrol line across the known convoy routes, sometimes stretching for hundreds of miles. Each boat maintained radio silence, listening, watching. When one commander spotted a convoy, he wouldn't attack. He would shadow the target and transmit its position, course, and speed back to U-boat headquarters in France. Then every submarine within range, sometimes a dozen or more, would converge on that single point. Only when the pack had assembled would they strike, usually at night, usually on the surface where their diesel engines gave them speed advantages over the convoy's escorts, and they would attack from all directions simultaneously. The convoy's destroyers and corvettes, typically outnumbered 3 or 4 to 1, would be overwhelmed. They would race off to chase one contact on their sonar, only to have 3 more submarines slip past them and torpedo the helpless merchant ships from point-blank range. For the merchant, sailors, it was a nightmare. Explosions in the darkness, ships breaking apart, men screaming in oil-covered water. For the U-boat crews, it was Die glückliche Zeit, the happy time. Between January and March of 1943 alone, the Wolfpack sank nearly 600,000 tons of Allied shipping. In March, 97 ships went down. Winston Churchill would later write in his memoirs that the U-boat peril was the only thing during the entire war that truly frightened him. Britain had perhaps 3 months of food reserves remaining. The mathematics were brutal and simple. Germany was winning. But hidden within this overwhelming success was a fatal weakness. A weakness so fundamental that once the Americans understood how to exploit it, the entire U-boat fleet would be doomed. The weakness was this. To execute the Wolfpack tactic, U-boats had to do 2 things that exposed them to detection and attack. First, they had to communicate. Constantly. The entire system depended on radio transmissions. Every captain had to report his position daily, report convoy sightings, acknowledge orders from headquarters, request permission to break off patrol. Each transmission, even if it lasted only seconds, was a signal that could be detected. Second, they had to surface. A Second World War U-boat was not a true submarine in the modern sense. It was really a torpedo boat that could temporarily hide underwater. Its powerful diesel engines needed air and could only run on the surface. Its massive battery banks, which powered the electric motors while submerged, had to be recharged by those diesel engines. This meant that every single day, often for hours at a time, a U-boat had to surface and run its diesels. exposed, vulnerable, visible to radar and aircraft. Dönitz understood these vulnerabilities, of course. He was too brilliant a strategist not to. But he had engineered solutions. To extend the range of his boats and keep them on patrol longer, he built the Type 14 supply submarines, nicknamed Milchkuher, or milk cows. These massive boats carried no torpedoes. They were floating fuel depots and supply ships. A wolf pack would rendezvous with a milk cow at a secret location hundreds of miles from shore, refuel, restock food and torpedoes, and return to the hunt. It was ingenious. As for the vulnerability to aircraft, Dönitz had calculated that the Atlantic simply had too much empty space. Allied patrol bombers flying from Britain or Iceland had a limited range. There was a vast gap in the mid-Atlantic, nearly 1,000 miles across, where no land-based aircraft could reach. This was the Black Pit, and this was where the wolf packs operated with near impunity. The convoy escorts, limited to surface ships, couldn't see far enough or move fast enough to catch U-boats running on the surface at night. By early 1943, Dönitz commanded over 400 operational U-boats. His force was larger, more experienced, and more successful than at any point in the war. He told Hitler that if given enough submarines, he could starve Britain into surrender within months. He believed it. His captains believed it. And for a time, the mathematics supported that belief. But across the Atlantic, in the highest levels of the United States Navy, a radically different solution to the U-boat problem was taking shape. The Americans had concluded that defending convoys was a losing strategy. You couldn't win a war playing defense. You had to go on offense. You had to hunt the hunters. But how do you hunt submarines in the middle of an ocean? The answer was being built in American shipyards at a rate that stunned even the Americans themselves. The escort carrier. These ships were not the famous fleet carriers like Enterprise or Hornet that dominated the Pacific. They were smaller, slower, and built on modified merchant ship hulls. The Navy called them CVEs. The sailors called them jeep carriers or baby flat tops. Some crews joked that CVE stood for combustible, vulnerable, expendable. But these unglamorous ships were about to change naval warfare forever. Each escort carrier carried approximately 24 aircraft, typically 12 Grumman 4F Wildcat fighters and 12 Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bombers. More importantly, they could steam at 15 knots for weeks at a time, going anywhere in the Atlantic. They were, in effect, mobile airfields that could be deployed directly into the Black Pit. The gap where U-boats felt safe. The gap that was about to become a killing ground. On March 5, 1943, the USS Bogue departed Norfolk, Virginia. She was the core of Task Group 21.12. The first dedicated hunter-killer group in the Atlantic. Her orders were simple and revolutionary. She was not to escort any convoy. She was to take her destroyers and her aircraft to the coordinates provided by Ultra-Intelligence, the top-secret code-breaking operation that had cracked, the German Enigma cipher, and she was to destroy every U-boat she could find. The German captains had no idea what was coming. They were accustomed to fighting destroyers, which they could hear approaching on their hydrophones and evade by diving. They had developed tactics for this. They had confidence in their training. What happened next would shatter that confidence utterly. May 1st, 1943. U-Boat Command logged 41 operational submarines at sea in the North Atlantic. By May 31st, 16 of those boats would be at the bottom of the ocean. Another 9 would be so badly damaged they would limp home and never sail again. The casualty rate was 61%, in a single month. This wasn't just a bad month. This was an apocalypse. And at the center of this carnage were the escort carriers and the 3 secret weapons they brought to the fight. Weapons that the U-boat crews couldn't see, couldn't hear, and couldn't defend against until it was too late. The first secret weapon was radar. But not the old metric wavelength radar that U-boats could detect with their METOX receivers. This was new centimetric radar, operating at 10 centimeters wavelength. The German equipment couldn't hear it at all. An Avenger bomber could be flying directly toward a surfaced U-boat, its radar locked on, and the boat's lookouts would have no warning until the aircraft was visible. By then, it was too late to crash dive. The second weapon was high-frequency direction finding, called Huff-Duff by the operators. This equipment was installed on the destroyers escorting the carriers. The instant a U-boat transmitted on its radio, even a half-second burst, the Huff-Duff operator would get a precise bearing to that transmission. When two ships in the task group got bearings, they could triangulate the U-boat's exact position. The very radio network that made the Wolfpack possible was now a beacon guiding the hunters straight to their targets. The third weapon was the most terrifying. It was officially designated the Mark 24 mine, a code name chosen to disguise its true nature. It wasn't a mine. It was the world's first acoustic homing torpedo. Nicknamed Fido, this weapon was dropped by parachute from an Avenger. Once in the water, it would begin to circle, listening with a sensitive acoustic sensor. The moment it detected the distinctive sound of a U-boat's propellers, it would turn toward that sound and hunt it down. A U-boat commander being chased by a Fido faced an impossible choice. If he ran, the propeller noise guided the torpedo straight to him. If he stopped his engines, he was deaf, blind, and defenseless as his batteries died. These three technologies, integrated with the mobility of the escort carriers and guided by ultra-intelligence that revealed the positions of U-boat patrol lines and supply rendezvous points, created a killing system of unprecedented lethality. And May 1943 was when the system reached full operational effectiveness. The month began with disaster. On May 1st, Convoy ONS-5, the one that U-192 was moving to intercept, became the target of the largest Wolfpack concentration of the entire war. 41 U-boats, nearly 10% of Germany's entire operational fleet, converged on this single convoy. The ensuing battle lasted 4 days and nights. The U-boats sank 13 merchant ships. By the standards of early 1943, this should have been counted as a German victory. But Dönitz lost 6 submarines in that battle, 6 boats and nearly 300 men. The exchange rate had reversed. For the first time, U-boats were dying faster than merchant ships. And then the escort carriers arrived. On May 5th, the USS Bogue's task group was operating southwest of Iceland when one of her Avengers, piloted by Lieutenant William Chamberlain, picked up a radar contact. The plane's ASV radar had detected something on the surface 12 miles away. Chamberlain pushed his throttle forward and descended through the cloud layer. Below him, U-269 was running on the surface, her diesels thrumming as her batteries recharged. The lookouts spotted the Avenger at the last moment. They screamed the alarm. The boat began its crash dive. But Chamberlain was already in his attack run. He released 4 Mark 47 depth charges, set to detonate at 50 feet. The explosions erupted around the diving submarine, massive columns of white water shooting 100 feet into the air. The shock waves ruptured U-269's pressure hull. The boat, mortally wounded, was forced back to the surface. Her crew scrambled onto the deck, waving white shirts and undershirts in surrender. A Canadian destroyer, HMCS Street Laurent, arrived to pick up the survivors. 43 men were pulled from the water. 12 had died in the attack. When the German sailors were brought aboard and given blankets and hot coffee, they were interrogated by the ship's intelligence officer. Their responses revealed something unexpected. These men weren't just defeated. They were psychologically shattered. One petty officer kept repeating the same question over and over. "How did you find us?" It was as if you could see through the ocean itself. Another sailor, a veteran of 2 years of patrols, said something that the interrogator noted in his report. "The Atlantic is no longer ours. You are everywhere now, everywhere at once." This was only the beginning. The USS Bogue would sink 4 more U-boats before the month was over. But she was just one carrier. By mid-May, there were 5 escort carrier task groups operating in the Atlantic, and they were learning, adapting, and becoming more lethal with every patrol. The Americans quickly realized that the true center of gravity for the Wolfpack system wasn't the attack boats themselves. It was the milk cows. Sink the supply submarines and the entire operational structure would collapse. Attack boats would be forced to abandon their patrols and limp home on half-empty fuel tanks. This insight led to a fundamental shift in hunting tactics. Ultra-intelligence would provide the coordinates of scheduled refueling rendezvous. The escort carriers would race to those positions and wait. And when the milk cows surfaced to meet their clients, the Avengers would be overhead. The massacre of the milk cows began on May 7th. An Avenger from USS Bogue caught U-117, a Type 10D milk cow, on the surface. The submarine was in the middle of transferring fuel to U-66 when the aircraft appeared. For both boats, there was no escape. They couldn't crash dive with fuel hoses still connected. Lieutenant Charles Stapler, the pilot, didn't hesitate. He rolled in and dropped 4 depth charges in a perfect straddle, U-117, carrying hundreds of tons of diesel fuel and spare torpedoes, vaporized in an explosion so massive that other aircraft saw the pillar of smoke and flame from 30 miles away. U-66 managed to cut the hoses and dive, but the boat was badly damaged. Her captain, Kapitänleutnant Gerhard Seehausen, filed a report with U-Boat Command when he finally reached port. That report, intercepted and decoded by Ultra, revealed the psychological impact of the attack. "We were caught utterly defenseless," Seehausen wrote. "The enemy aircraft appeared without warning. Our radar detectors gave no alarm. The milk cow was destroyed before our eyes. We barely escaped with our lives. I must report that the morale of my crew has been severely affected. They now believe that sailing from port is sailing to certain death." This was not an isolated opinion. Throughout May, similar reports flooded into U-boat headquarters in Paris. Kapitänleutnant Herbert Werner, commanding U-230, wrote in his war diary after narrowly surviving an air attack, "The enemy appears to know our position at all times. They arrive without warning. Their weapons are impossibly accurate. We are no longer hunters. We are animals being herded towards slaughter." The attacks intensified. On May 11th, aircraft from USS Bogue sank U-569. On May 12th, they destroyed U-640. Each attack followed the same pattern. Ultra-intelligence provided the location. The carrier group steamed to that position. The Avengers, equipped with the new centimetric radar that the Germans couldn't detect, found the U-boats on the surface, and the Mark 24 acoustic torpedoes or depth charges finished them. But Admiral Dönitz was not a man who gave up easily. He was a hard, determined commander who believed absolutely in the superiority of his U-boat arm. His response to the mounting losses was not to withdraw his boats from the Atlantic. It was to fight back more aggressively. On May 14th, Dönitz issued a new operational order to all U-boats at sea. The order was radical and would prove catastrophic. U-boats were now instructed to remain on the surface when attacked by aircraft and fight back with their anti-aircraft guns. Every Type 7C U-boat carried at least one 20mm cannon and often a 37mm gun as well. Dönitz calculated that if his boats could shoot down enough aircraft, the Americans would be forced to change their tactics. He was wrong. Catastrophically wrong. The American pilots, many of them veterans of the Pacific Theater, were more than willing to engage in gun battles with surfaced submarines. And the U-boats discovered very quickly that trading fire with an 4F Wildcat fighter or a TBF Avenger was a losing proposition. On June 5th, aircraft from the Bogue encountered U-217 on the surface. The German gun crews opened fire as the planes approached. The battle that followed lasted 18 minutes. The Wildcats came in first, strafing the conning tower and deck with their 50 caliber machine guns, killing or wounding the exposed gun, the crews. Then the Avengers made their attack runs, dropping depth charges that detonated alongside the hull. U-217 sank with all 50 crew members. There were no survivors. The pilot's after-action report was chilling in its brevity. Submarine sank stern first at 15:30 hours. no survivors observed. Similar battles occurred throughout May and June. On May 24th, U-467 tried to fight off an air attack. The submarine's guns damaged one Avenger, but the boat was hit by multiple depth charges and sank. On June 1st, U-418 engaged in a gun battle that lasted nearly half an hour before being overwhelmed and destroyed. Dauntlesses' order to fight on the surface wasn't just failing, it was sending boats and crews to their deaths even faster. By mid-June, he quietly rescinded the order. But the damage was done. U-boat crew morale, which had been the foundation of the entire arm's effectiveness, was collapsing. The quality gap was becoming stark. The veteran aces, the men who had commanded boats since 1939 and 40, were almost all gone, dead or rotated back to training commands or simply too psychologically damaged to continue. They were being replaced by younger and younger officers, some barely in their mid-20s, with truncated training and inexperienced crews. These new captains were being sent to sea in what they increasingly understood were iron coffins. One of the most dramatic individual stories from Black May involves U-405, commanded by Captain Lieutenant Rolf Heinrich Hoppmann. Hoppmann was an experienced commander with 2 years of successful patrols behind him. On the night of October 31st, 1943, his boat was operating south of Iceland when it was detected by the destroyer USS Bory, part of the USS Card's hunter-killer group. The Bory attacked with depth charges, damaging U-405 and forcing her to surface. Hoppmann, unable to dive, and with his boat crippled, made the desperate decision to fight it out with his deck gun. What followed was one of the most savage close-quarters naval battles of the entire war. The Atlantic was in the grip of a fierce storm. Waves 20 feet high crashed over both vessels. The Bory charged in to ram the U-boat, but in the heavy seas, the destroyer's helmsman misjudged the angle. Instead of striking cleanly, the Bory's bow rode up onto U-405's forward deck. The two ships locked together, rising and falling with the massive swells. For 10 minutes, the crews fought each other at point-blank range. Machine guns chattered, rifles cracked, pistols fired. The American gunners couldn't depress their main guns low enough to hit the U-boat directly beneath them, so they improvised. Sailors threw everything they could find: empty shell casings, coffee mugs, wrenches. One sailor famously hurled a sheath knife that stuck into the conning tower just inches from a German officer's head. Eventually, a large wave wrenched the two ships apart. The Bory backed off and opened fire with every weapon she had. Over 4,000 rounds of 20mm and 40mm ammunition poured into U-405. The submarine, torn apart by gunfire, sank, taking Hoppmann and most of his crew with it. But the Bory had been mortally wounded in the ramming. Her bow was split open, and she was taking on water faster than the pumps could handle. The next morning, her captain gave the order to abandon ship. The crew was rescued by other destroyers in the task group, and the Bory was scuttled. It was a mutual kill, a battle so ferocious and primal that it demonstrated how desperate and close quarters the U-boat war had become, and it was indicative of a larger truth. The U-boats were no longer winning, they were simply dying harder. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By late May 1943, the statistics were undeniable. Germany had lost 41 U-boats in a single month, the highest monthly loss rate of the entire war. And Dönitz knew these were not just numbers. These were boats he couldn't replace quickly enough, and crews he couldn't train fast enough. On May 24th, he made the decision that marked the true end of the Wolfpack era. He ordered all U-boats in the North Atlantic to withdraw. They were to return to their bases in France and Norway. The Great Offensive was over. In his war diary, Dönitz wrote something remarkable. "We have lost the Battle of the Atlantic. The enemy has achieved air supremacy over the entire ocean. Our boats can no longer operate in the conditions that now exist." This was an extraordinary admission from a man who had built his entire reputation on the invincibility of the U-boat arm. But reality could no longer be denied. The Americans and British had not just gained an advantage, they had achieved complete tactical and technological superiority. But Dönitz, being Dönitz, did not give up. Germany would continue to send U-boats to sea for the rest of the war. But the focus shifted. Instead of hunting convoys in wolf packs, boats operated individually. Instead of the mid-Atlantic, they focused on coastal areas where air cover was less comprehensive. And Germany threw enormous resources into developing new technologies that might restore the balance. The snorkel, a breathing tube that allowed a U-boat to run its diesels while remaining just below the surface. The Type 21 U-boat, a revolutionary design that was faster underwater than on the surface and could stay submerged for days. But all of these innovations came too late. The Type 21 didn't enter service until 1945, just months before Germany's surrender. And by then, the quality of U-boat crews had deteriorated so badly that even superior technology couldn't save them. Commanders who might have used these new boats effectively were almost all dead. In their place were teenagers with a few weeks of training, sent to sea by a regime that had run out of options. The human cost was staggering. Of approximately 40,000 men who served in the German U-boat service during the war, 30,000 died. A 75% casualty rate, the highest of any military service in any nation during the entire Second World War, higher than the Japanese kamikaze pilots, higher than Soviet penal battalions, higher than anything. And the irony, the bitter irony that the surviving U-boat commanders would discuss in prisoner of war camps and in memoirs written decades later, was that they had been defeated by the very tactic they had pioneered, the wolf pack. Dönitz had invented coordinated group tactics for submarines. The Americans had simply applied the same principle, but with better technology. The hunter-killer groups were wolf packs of ships and aircraft, coordinated by radio and radar, converging on U-boats from multiple directions and overwhelming them with superior numbers and firepower. The Germans had written the playbook. The Americans had simply executed it better. There was one final symbolic moment that captured the totality of the U-boat's defeat. On June 4, 1944, just 2 days before the D-Day landings, Captain Daniel Gallery, commanding the hunter-killer group centered on USS Guadalcanal, achieved something unprecedented. His task group had been tracking U-505 for hours, guided by Huff-Duff bearings on the boat's radio transmissions. When they caught up, the destroyers attacked with depth charges, forcing the U-boat to surface. The German crew, believing their boat was sinking, began to abandon ship. But Gallery had a different plan. He had trained his men for months for this exact scenario. He wanted to capture a U-boat intact. A boarding party from the destroyer escort USS Pillsbury, led by Lieutenant Albert David, leaped from their whaleboat onto the deck of the still-circling, still-sinking submarine. They fought their way down through the conning tower into the control room. Inside, they found the boat flooding, with scuttling charges set to explode. In an act of extraordinary courage, Lieutenant David and his men located the explosive charges, disarmed them, and managed to close the seacocks that were flooding the hull. They saved the submarine minutes before it would have plunged to the bottom. The Americans had done the impossible. They had captured an enemy warship on the high seas for the first time since the War of 1812. But U-505 was more than just a trophy. It was an intelligence windfall. The Americans captured the boat's Enigma machine, all of its current codebooks, operational charts, and technical manuals. Every remaining secret of the U-boat arm was now in Allied hands. The submarine was towed to Bermuda and eventually to the United States. Today, U-505 sits on permanent display at the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago. You can walk through it. You can see the cramped quarters where 50 men lived for months at a time. You can see the torpedo room, the diesel engines, the conning tower. And if you understand what that boat represents, it's a profoundly melancholy experience. Because U-505 is a monument to brave men who were sent to fight a war they could not win with weapons that were obsolete before they ever left port. When the great invasion fleets assembled for D-Day on June 6, 1944, they sailed without fear of the wolf packs. 150,000 men crossed the English Channel with minimal naval opposition. The U-boat arm, which had nearly strangled Britain just 2 years earlier, was conspicuously absent. A few boats tried to interfere with the invasion, but they were hunted down and destroyed with casual efficiency by the now overwhelming Allied air and naval forces. The Battle of the Atlantic was over. Germany had lost. But what does it mean to say the U-boat commanders were shocked? This requires understanding what shock truly means in this context. It wasn't simply the surprise of encountering a new weapon or tactic. It was something far more profound and psychologically devastating. It was the shock of realizing that everything you believed about your superiority, about your technological edge, about your tactical brilliance, was an illusion. And worse, that your enemy had been watching you, tracking you, and preparing your destruction for months while you believed you were winning. The interrogation reports from captured U-boat officers reveal this psychological trauma repeatedly. One commander, captured after his boat was sunk in June 1943, told his interrogators something that was recorded in the classified debriefing files. "We believed we were fighting the British and Americans. Men like ourselves, with similar capabilities and limitations, but it became clear that we were fighting something else, an intelligence that could see everywhere, that knew our positions before we transmitted them, that could strike from the sky in the middle of the ocean, where no aircraft should exist. It was as if we were fighting ghosts who could read our minds." Another officer, Captain Lieutenant Werner Henke, commander of U-515, was captured after his boat was sunk by aircraft from USS Guadalcanal in April 1944. Henke was a Knight's Cross recipient, one of Germany's most decorated U-boat aces. During his interrogation at Fort Hunt in Virginia, he said something remarkable. "In 1940 and 41, we felt invincible. The British could not stop us. We sank ships at will. But by 43, we knew. Every patrol was a suicide mission. We went to sea knowing we would not return, but we went anyway because we were told it was our duty. In the end, duty killed more of us than enemy action." This sense of futility, of being sent repeatedly into battles that couldn't be won, took a devastating psychological toll. Post-war studies of surviving U-boat veterans found extraordinarily high rates of what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder. Many survivors struggled with survivor's guilt, haunted by the memory of friends and crew members who died while they lived. One survivor, speaking decades later, described what it was like to serve on a U-boat in the final 2 years of the war. "Every time we left port, we would pass the memorial to fallen U-boat men, and we would see new names added every time. Men we knew, men we had trained with, and we knew our names would be added soon, but still we sailed." The Germans tried everything to adapt. The introduction of the snorkel in late 1943 allowed U-boats to operate submerged for longer periods. But it wasn't enough. The snorkel had its own problems. It was detectable by radar. It left a visible wake, and operating at snorkel depth for extended periods was exhausting for the crew, who had to endure the diesel fumes and the constant pitching motion in heavy seas. The acoustic torpedo, which Germany developed as its own countermeasure to Allied destroyers, proved unreliable and sometimes circled back to destroy the U-boat that fired it. The Type 21 submarine, which entered service in early 1945, was genuinely revolutionary. It was fast, quiet, and could stay submerged for days using an improved battery system. But only 2 Type 21s ever conducted combat patrols, and neither sank any ships before the war ended. The technology had arrived too late, and the crews were too inexperienced to use it effectively. By 1945, U-boat training had been compressed from 2 years to just a few months. Commanders who in 1940 would have spent months in advanced tactical training were now being sent to sea with barely enough time to learn how to dive the boat safely. The final months of the U-boat war descended into futility. Boats were still being sent on patrol, but everyone involved knew they were accomplishing nothing. From January to May 1945, 56 U-boats were sunk, They destroyed only 31 Allied ships in that same period. The exchange rate had become catastrophically unfavorable, and yet they continued because Hitler and Dönitz insisted that the U-boats were tying down Allied resources that would otherwise be used against Germany. This was technically true, but the cost in young lives was horrific. When Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, 156 U-boats were still at sea. Dönitz ordered them all to surface, signal their positions, and surrender to the nearest Allied port. Many captains complied, some did not. Several U-boats scuttled themselves rather than surrender. U-2506, one of the revolutionary Type 21s, was deliberately sunk by her crew in the North Sea rather than be handed over to the British. Her captain couldn't bear the thought of the enemy examining his boat. The human statistics of the U-boat war are almost impossible to comprehend. Of the approximately 1,100 U-boats that Germany built and commissioned during the war, 785 were lost to enemy action or accidents. Of the roughly 40,000 men who served aboard them, 30,000 died at sea. 3 out of every 4 men who went to sea in a U-boat never came home. No other military service in any nation during the Second World War suffered casualties even remotely comparable, and the vast majority of those deaths, perhaps 20,000 men, occurred after May 1943, after Black May, after the moment when it became clear that the Battle of the Atlantic was lost. This raises an uncomfortable question that historians still debate. Why did Germany continue sending U-boats to sea when the outcome was no longer in doubt? Dönitz's own writings provide part of the answer. He believed, perhaps correctly, that as long as U-boats were operating in the Atlantic, the Allies had to devote enormous resources to anti-submarine warfare. Hundreds of ships, thousands of aircraft, tens of thousands of personnel, resources that couldn't be used elsewhere. In his calculus, even if his boats weren't sinking many ships, they were still serving a strategic purpose by tying down Allied assets. But this cold, strategic logic meant that 20,000 young men were sent to die in a battle that was already lost, serving as what amounted to a distraction. The survivors carried these ghosts with them for the rest of their lives. Peter Kremer, who commanded U-333 and survived the war, wrote in his memoir, "We were not Nazis. We were sailors. We fought for Germany, not for Hitler. But in the end, we were used by a regime that cared nothing for our lives. We were expendable, and 30,000 of our comrades paid the price for that expendability." Herbert Werner, who survived multiple patrols and wrote one of the most famous U-boat memoirs, "Iron coffins," described the survivors' burden. "I lived. So many better men than I died. Why? There is no answer to that question. I stopped looking for one decades ago." The strategic legacy of the hunter-killer groups extended far beyond the Second World War. The system developed by the US Navy in 1943, the integration of intelligence, air power, and surface forces into a coordinated hunting machine, became the template for modern naval warfare. The carrier strike groups that the United States Navy deploys today are direct descendants of those escort carrier task groups. They use the same fundamental principles. Intelligence identifies the target. Aircraft provide the reach and striking power. Surface ships provide protection and additional capabilities. And everything is coordinated through advanced communications. The Soviet Union studied the American hunter-killer tactics intensely during the Cold War. When they built their nuclear submarine fleet, they designed it specifically to counter carrier battle groups, knowing that those groups were the greatest threat to submarines. The cat-and-mouse game between submarines and anti-submarine forces that defined much of Cold War naval strategy was a direct continuation of the lessons learned in the North Atlantic between 1940 and 45. The technology changed. Nuclear submarines could stay submerged for months. Sophisticated sonar replaced crude hydrophones. Guided missiles replaced depth charges and acoustic torpedoes. But the fundamental dynamic remained the same. The lone hunter, no matter how technologically advanced, cannot survive against a coordinated, intelligent, and relentless pack. Today, if you visit the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago, and walk through U-505. You can see the cramped bunks where the crew slept in shifts. You can see the tiny galley where meals were prepared for 50 men. You can see the torpedo room where the weapons that sank Allied ships were loaded and fired. And you can see the conning tower where the commander would have stood, scanning the horizon, hoping to see a convoy before an aircraft saw him. It's a sobering experience, because U-505 is not just a museum piece. It's a tomb for a way of warfare that was rendered obsolete by technological and tactical innovation. The lesson of Black May and the hunter-killer groups is not that technology always wins. The Germans had excellent technology. Their submarines were well designed and their torpedoes were often superior to Allied equivalents. The lesson is that warfare is a system, and the side that builds the better system, that integrates intelligence, technology, tactics, and operational art into a coherent whole, will defeat the side that relies on individual brilliance or technological superiority in isolated areas. The Wolfpack was a system, but the hunter-killer group was a better system, and in modern warfare, the better system wins. For the men who fought in U-boats, for the 30,000 who died and the 10,000 who survived, this strategic analysis would have meant nothing. They were not chess pieces in a grand strategic game. They were young men, many still in their teens, who believed they were fighting for their country. They showed extraordinary courage in the most claustrophobic and terrifying conditions imaginable. And they were betrayed by a leadership that sent them to die in battles that could not be won for strategic purposes that, in the end, made no difference to the outcome of the war. When Kapitän-Leutnant Klaus Hartmann stood in the conning tower of U-192 on that morning in May 1943 and saw an aircraft carrier where no carrier should have been, he had perhaps 30 seconds of conscious thought before his boat was attacked and sunk. In those 30 seconds, everything he believed about the war, about German superiority, about his chances of survival, shattered. He was one of 41 U-boat commanders who died that month. One of 30,000 who would die before the war ended, one of hundreds of thousands who died believing in a victory that was never going to come. The escort carriers, those unglamorous jeep carriers that the Navy once called combustible, vulnerable, and expendable, proved to be one of the decisive weapons of the Second World War. They closed the Black Pit, they broke the wolf packs, and they taught the world that in modern warfare, the side that controls the air controls the sea. That lesson remains true today, 3/4 of a century later, in every ocean on Earth. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.